you did send me some questions, and if you're going to be living in Mexico, I want you to think about, if living in the United States, we have issues around cultural diversity, and companies and corporate companies pay a lot of money to help people to understand each other and cultural similarities and differences. Now imagine now, and you don't have to imagine it because you now live in a different country, a different culture. So I'm going to talk about that first, even though that was the last question that was sent, because I think it's a very important part of living in a different country, working in a different country, doing business in a different country. And you have an expert in your group, Julia, who is an expert in cultural diversity. But I will speak from my experience and from my background. I've done business in Mexico. Prior to coming to retire in Mexico, I had a binational business consulting company. My husband and I did. And we had attorneys and accountants and different experts that helped individuals who wanted to do business in the U.S. from Mexico, and people from the U.S. who wanted to do business in the United States. And we also did cultural diversity training to companies in the U.S. So from my experience, both on a personal level, because I am bilingual, bicultural, the differences that I believe are very important is the cultural formalities. And to me it seems like, there's a conflict between the formalities of the Mexican culture and then how we sometimes interact. So, as an example, when you're in the business setting, when you're addressing someone, if they have a bachelor's degree, you would address them as licenciado or licenciada.
Can you repeat that, please?
Licenciado or licenciada. That's a very, very formal way of addressing someone. You're addressing them by their level of education.
So how would you say it?
Licenciado or licenciada. Licenciada Joy, I don't know your last name. Point?
Price.
Praise?
Price.
Price. Price. Licenciada Price, ¿cómo está? Blah, 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 blah. Licenciada, blah, blah, blah. If she was an engineer, I would say ingeniera, blah, blah, Price. If she was an accountant, I would say contadora Price. If she was an attorney, and so forth and so on. So that's like a very basic thing. We don't do that in the U.S. We address people either by their last name or their first name. We're very informal, even in business settings. Where I perceive that there's kind of like a conflict is that once you get to know the person, then they don't just address you with a handshake, but they give you a hug and a kiss, like Julia, when we interacted, because we've met before, we've known each other, we greeted each other with a hug and a kiss. So on the one hand, there's formalities, and even though this is a business setting, and Julia and I don't necessarily have a personal relationship where we're all friends, we still address each other with a hug and a kiss. You would call me licenciada Erendira, licenciada Abel, and if we had a relationship, we'd hug. Not when you first meet me, no. So another difference is that in English we only use you to address someone, you. But in Spanish there's two ways of addressing someone. One is tú, which means you, and usted, which is the formal way of addressing someone, meaning you. Another thing that is very different that Americans and possibly Canadians and possibly Europeans have a difficult time with is the concept of time. So you might schedule an appointment and you're there 15 minutes before, and the person you're going to be meeting with is 30, 40, sometimes even an hour later, right? And the concept of work. In the United States, we live to work. Work defines us. What we do defines us. If we lose that job, we lose our identity. Where in Mexico, they work to live. It's a very important concept. In Mexico, people enjoy life, even if there's a lot of stress, even if there's, many things happening. They enjoy life, they enjoy meals, they enjoy relationships, they enjoy family, even if they work very long hours, and many do. But sometimes when people have biases, have racism, they don't realize that they do. They'll say things that could be offensive without knowing what they said. And so I think relaxing sometimes our rigid way of looking at life and thinking that the way that things are done where we come from is the right way. Relaxing and learning about the culture without criticizing. So the question was, what are some key cultural differences between Mexicans, Americans, and Canadians? I don't know the Canadian culture, but I know the American culture. I have lived both in Mexico and I have lived in the United States. I have done business in Mexico and I have done business in the United States. I think being uptight about the cultural differences and thinking that our way or the way that things are done in the United States is the right way is how you will damage a relationship, a business relationship. So I wanted to address that first before I got into how do you legally do business in Mexico. So relax while doing business in Mexico. If the person that you're supposed to be meeting is 30 minutes late, you may feel upset and angry about it. Don't show it. Don't show it. Understand that that is the way that the culture is. And that's it. Accept it if you're going to live here. Otherwise, you're going to be stressed out a lot.
There's one thing that is different. I'm coming from, as I said, English people and Mexican people and Spanish people and most other people are much more relaxed when they meet one another. And a hug doesn't mean, it's a hug. But to an English person, as they explain it, to a Spanish person or a Mexican person who stand this close, to an English person who stand this close, it's one of the hardest things I got over was when people would hug me. Because to me that was too familiar.
Too intrusive. I forgot to say that we have a mic, and I'm going to ask you to hold your questions and comments until the end. But there is a mic here that when you do ask questions, you'll be able to use so that it could be heard in the video. But thank you for that comment. Thank you for that comment. That is definitely, proximity, how close you are to someone, invading my space. I grew up hugging and kissing people. and so, but I've had American friends who just, I mean, I could sense their body language saying, "You're too close." Okay. So let's talk about how do you become legal and doing business in Mexico? So the processes begin in the U.S. because the expectation is that you're not living here illegally. The expectation is that you're in the U.S. and then you're going to come and live in Mexico. I guess the same way the United States would expect immigrants, right? So it's the same thing. But we know that that's not the case. We know that there are many Americans who come here with the intent of living here and don't become legal right away. So you would need to go to a U.S. consulate, not a U.S. consulate, I'm sorry, a Mexican consulate. And the Mexican consulates are in the United States. I emphasize that because I've had many clients ask me, "Oh, the Mexican consulate, is it in Tijuana?" I said, "No, it's the Mexican consulates. Consulates are in the foreign country. And in the United States, that's the foreign country to Mexico." So it starts at the Mexican consulate. You submit an application. There's an application that you submit. And the most important part of becoming accepted as a legal resident is solvency. Can you afford to live in Mexico is basically what the question is. And how that's determined, the legal determination of that is for investments, it's the minimum wage in Mexico times 20,000 days of the minimum wage. So you multiply what's the minimum wage times 20, and that's in terms of investments for a permanent resident. And I'm going to clarify that because it's very confusing, but I will clarify. That's the legal requirement. For temporary, it's 5,000 for investments, 5,000 days times the daily minimum wage. Okay? And for income, it would be 300 days times the minimum wage in Mexico. Because the consulates are in different parts of the world, including the United States, every consulate will have actually a different amount. And this is where I will try to clarify. So I'm going to use the San Diego requirement, okay? So the San Diego requirement is it's $2,000 a month of income or retirement pension for temporary residency. If you don't qualify for permanent, then you look at temporary residency. Again, using San Diego's requirement, it's 1,200 of income, and you have to have that for San Diego. You have to have that as an average balance at the end of the month. So it's not just what goes in, but your average balance. And then for investments, it's 20,200. They will only use either income, pension, and that would be in checking accounts or checking account for the last 6 months, or they'll use investments. You can't combine the two. So let's say you have investments, but you don't have quite $80,000, and you want to use your income to make up the difference. You can't do that. It's one or the other. You either use your income or you use investments, one or the other. And so that's the main thing is solvency. Now with my clients, I strategize, and my goal is always to try to help my clients to become permanent residents. Why? Because if you're a temporary resident, you are approved initially for 1 year, and then you then go in after 1 year. You could renew up to 3 years, and every time when you renew, you have to pay. There's a fee that you have to pay. You pay initially when you apply, and then you pay when you renew. So my goal is always to try to get my clients to be permanent. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes we have to strategize for 6 months. We're going to wait 6 months. I help my clients to strategize, because sometimes it seems like, oh, I'm not going to be able to do this. This is impossible. Well, we can try to figure out ways. I brainstorm with my clients. I don't just say, this is a requirement, this is what you have to do, that's it. Okay, so that is how you become a legal resident of Mexico. If you get the permanent residency, then you're able to work. If you have a temporary residency and you've applied to be a resident initially not to work, and you then want to change to be able to work, as a permanent resident, all they have to do is notify immigration that, oh, I'm going to start working, and that's it. But if you are a temporary resident, whoever is going to hire you needs to request you. They have to write a letter. There are documents that they have to show that they are a company that could hire foreigners. So there's things that the company that's going to hire you is going to have to do. But let's say you want to work for yourself. So if you want to work for yourself, then forming a corporation would be a way that you can go. You form a corporation, and then the corporation will request you. Your own corporation will then request you. Either the individual or corporation has to go through a process to be approved to hire foreigners. You just don't start hiring foreigners and that's it. So your friend can't say, okay, I'm going to request you. I have a corporation, I'm going to request you. That's not how it works. The company that's going to hire you needs to file with immigration a document called Constancia de Inscripción de Empleador. It's an employer document that has to be submitted. They have to show their corporation papers, the deed of incorporation, the bylaws, any amendments, if there's a power of attorney for the person who's in charge of the company, or a legal representative, their valid ID. They have to show proof of a legal address in Mexico. And the company has to have what's called an RFC, RFC. That's the tax identification for the company. They have to show that. They have to show the last tax report. They have to also show a list of foreign employees and their nationalities. If it's an individual, you have to have a tax ID, and that's the RFC. You can't get that unless you're a legal resident. So the first step in the process of doing business in Mexico legally is to get your residency, your legal residency. That's the first step. As a foreigner, you can set up a Mexican corporation, and you don't necessarily have to be a legal resident. So there's different ways that you could start the process. You could establish a corporation, and while the corporation is being established, you could start your legal residency, or you start your legal residency and then you establish your Mexican corporation. There's also another document that you get once you become a legal resident that's also required, which is called the CURP. In Spanish it's called the CURP. You'll hear that word CURP. You also get that after you become a legal resident, after you get either your permanent resident visa or your temporary visa. I've heard people say it's simple, and then I've heard people say it's complicated. Well, it's a different legal system, it's a different culture, it's a different government system. So I actually wanted to do a PowerPoint, but there wasn't a way of me to do that. So I did this little chart. Okay, so everybody starts at the Mexican consulate. Mexican consulates are in the U.S. At the Mexican consulate, they're going to insert a visa in your passport. It's actually inserted in your passport. And that visa will say whether or not you've been approved as a permanent resident or as a temporary resident. Based on what? Who could tell me based on what? Solvency. Solvency. Once you have that, you have 180 days. 180 days to do a canje. And the canje, it basically means an exchange. So you have 180 days. So I have clients, for example, that really plan way ahead of time. I've had clients that in a year they're going to move. They call me. I said, okay, 6 months before you move, we'll start the process. So 180 days, 6 months. This is done at the INM. INM stands for, it's the Mexican immigration. At the border. At the border is when you do that. Some of my clients, we go to the Mexican consulate, they get approved, we stop at the border, they get their exchange, and then we immediately start working on their card. So once you've done that, then it's time to go to the immigration office, and in this area it would either be, depending on where you live. If you live in San Antonio del Mar, that would be Tijuana. And if you're going to do Tijuana, you have to be there like 7:30 in the morning to get in line. Or Rosarito, and this is at the government building here in Rosarito, or in Ensenada. For this area, those would be the 3 immigration offices. I offer a consultation. It's a 30-minute initial consultation. If anyone is interested, you can go to my website, Baja Expat Services .com, and you can schedule an initial consultation. It seems simple, but there's different issues with different people. That's why people ask me general questions, and I could give you general information. But once I talk to my clients, then they tell me, because I have a series of questions that I ask, and they go, okay, no, we can't do, we can't do what you were thinking we could do. Because they'll tell me, oh, I went on the website, I did, and every consulate has a different amount. I gave you San Diego's. Not only do they have different amounts, they have different idiosyncrasies of that particular office. They could ask you for more information. They could ask you for less information. They will like things done a certain way. My rate of approval was 100% until I had a young man who was going to be working at an orphanage here. He had a particular situation, and the letter that I wrote for him, they didn't like one word, and that was, what was it? It was a nonprofit. I used the word nonprofit business. They didn't like that I put business in the letter. And so they turned us back for that one little word. So you probably have heard stories of people that have gone 2, 3 times, and finally some people have told me they've gone many times, and they finally give up. So this young man ruined that little word ruined my 100% approval rate that I had. But I won't use the word business again on that letter when I have another client with similar issues. But every consulate is different. These 3 offices are the ones that I primarily deal with. I have had some clients from Los Cabos, and I've sent them to the immigration offices in Los Cabos. I know the idiosyncrasies of these 3 offices, and now I know some idiosyncrasies from Los Cabos. They got approved right away, so that I did something right. Are there any questions?
If a couple wants to be a permanent resident, and that's net, right? That $2,000 or $1,200 is net. That's what's in the bank. So in a country that's a third the living expense of the U.S. purportedly, or less, but yet a couple has to show $48,000 net, which would be $60,000 gross, to live in Mexico, when they can live comfortably on that amount in the U.S., which costs 3 times more. Why does Mexico demand such a high level of income?
It doesn't matter whether you could live in the U.S. or in Mexico and whatever income it is. That's what the requirement is. I mean, see, that's sort of a judgment type of a question. It really doesn't matter whether you could live on what amount. That's the law in Mexico. It's so many days times the minimum wage. So I can't think of any other way to answer it other than to say that's what the requirement is. There are some consulates that will take the main person, the head of household, their income, and then if they have a spouse, then it will be $500. But I can't remember right now whether San Diego allows that or not. I would have to research that.
Okay, well, that would seem a bit more fair. A separate question. So when you're talking about legal resident in order to get a business license, that's a permanent, not a temporary resident, correct? You must be a permanent resident?
So there's no business license in Mexico. What you do is you get, once you become a legal resident, you get the CURP, the CURP. That's an identifier, a government identifier. And then once you have that, you can get your RFC, RFC. And then you can set up a corporation.
And you can do that as a temporary resident?
You can get that as a temporary, but as a temporary initially, unless if you, let's say Joy is requested. She is such an extraordinary real estate agent. Baja 123 says, I want you to come and work for me. And she's living in the U.S. So Baja 123 has to go through that process I spoke about to hire foreigners. They give her the documents that she needs in order to be hired. And then so she could go in as a temporary, applying as a temporary resident because a company has requested her to work here. Or she applies for temporary residency, and then while she's here, she goes to Baja 123, and they just love the way that she's, all her work history and so forth, and they say, we want to hire you. Well, they're going to, Baja 123, using that as an example, has to be already approved to be able to hire foreigners, and then they can request her, even though she's already a temporary resident. But she's initially a temporary resident without having approval to work.
And so you could do the same thing if all of a sudden you decided to make piñatas or something and you thought, I want to get into the piñata making business, and you're a temporary resident. You could then progress into being a business person here in Mexico on that basis.
Yes, or buy a business, but you have to get approved to be able to work or make money in Mexico, whether it's buy a business, whether it's start a business, because you could buy a business but not necessarily run the business, right?
Cool. Elizabeth?
Great.
Said-
Mike.
Oh, hello. You said that, is this working? It's just recording. Okay. You mentioned income, I'm assuming earned income versus investment as a way of getting residency. And what is meant by investments exactly?
So it would be IRAs, it would be CDs, it would be, I don't know, whatever other forms of investment. I'm not a financial planner, so.
There are some in-between things, like what if somebody is supporting you financially?
That's not an investment.
It's not an investment, but it's not an income exactly. It's not an earned income.
So if you can show that there's that amount of money going into your bank account, and you can show, maybe you have maybe you were married before, and your ex-husband is continuing alimony, and if you could show that, and you could show that you've had it for the past 6 months.
It is a 6-month requirement.
It's a 6-month requirement.
And
If it's investment, then it would be your financial.
no, I'm talking
About that, okay. So income, when I say income, I'm not talking about necessarily earned income. It could be a pension, it could be Social Security, it could be you have properties and you get rental income. It could be you have a business in the U.S. and you're getting income from that.
Alimony, child support, things like that as well, and money coming in.
But for that, you have a court document. What if you don't have a court document?
See, we're getting into some specifics that, would require, So that's what I'm talking about in terms of, that's a perfect example of, here is what's black and white, but then there's all these other shades of gray. That you have to move into the black and white area, find a way to move it into that. So that's part of what I do with my clients, is figure out their specific situation and see if we could figure out a way to make it work for them. Yes.
Is a business license of any sort required?
Do you need your CURP?
That's the business license.
There's not a business license. It's an identifier. Okay. It's an identifier code, and you need your CURP, your CURP, and your RFC, and then you can set up a Sociedad Anónima, which is a form of a corporation, but no business license the way that we understand it in the U.S.
The reason I asked was about a year ago at one of the FRAO meetings, the Foreign Resident Assistance Office, there was a speaker there, and they said if you're operating any kind of business in the Rosarito area, you needed to go to the city hall and buy a business license for $185.
I'm not familiar with that.
Do you help with citizenship?
I do. The citizenship issue, it's two different types of citizenship. One is after you have been and then within that there's differences, but after you've been a permanent resident for 5 years, you can apply to be nationalized, or if you have parents who were born in Mexico and you show direct lineage of a Mexican citizen, then you can apply for dual citizenship. For naturalization, you need to know Spanish, you need to know about the culture, you need to know you need to know about the history. So in the Spanish class that I teach, I incorporate things about the culture. And I tell my students, if you ever decide that you want to become, get your citizenship, you're getting an extra in my class. But yes.
Isn't there an age requirement for knowing Spanish? Above a certain age, you don't have to really speak Spanish. Is that right?
Yes. So if you're a senior citizen, like we all are, maybe someone in here isn't, but then they still see how much Spanish you know. I mean, you need to know something, but it's not as stringent as, for example, I have a young couple that are my clients, and because I teach Spanish, I was able to do an assessment, and I said, no, you won't be ready. You need to learn more Spanish. And because they're a young couple, they're going to be tested more stringently. So they give us a break, those of us who are over 60.
Over 70?
Over 55. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. And I hope that it was clear. You know,